Bitcoin Matters.
Today I'll be discussing the concept of hyperbitcoinization with my co-host Akin Fernandez. We'll discuss concepts like fiat currency, hyperinflation, and finally we'll discuss what a post-hyperbitcoinization world may look like.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about what is hyperbitcoinization. So hyperbitcoinization, and Akin, I'll let you lead with this. How would you define it?
Well, I wouldn't define it. I would take the definition that was given to me by the people who created that term and then react to that term that they created. And hyperbitcoinization, to cut a long story short, is the dominance of Bitcoin over fiat and the transformation of the economy from the fiat world to Bitcoin. And this has happened several times in the past before Bitcoin. Whenever you've had a hyperinflation event in a country and they stop using the local currency and start using a foreign currency, in the 20th century, it's normally the dollar they start using, it's essentially the same thing. Only this time, it's not going to be a sovereign fiat currency that's the replacement currency. It's going to be Bitcoin. And this is a very, very, very interesting and unique situation because it's going to be the first time that a fiat currency is replaced by something that's not a fiat currency. Also, it's probably going to be the last time in many places in the world that a fiat currency is replaced at all. Bitcoin, I'm pretty sure, is going to be the final currency that all of these countries get put onto once their own currencies hyperinflate. There won't be another chance for the state to replace an old currency with a new fiat currency because nobody will accept it. Everybody will understand that the currency the state's trying to replace with a new fiat currency is just the same as the old fiat currency. And so Bitcoin will cause a psychological change and a sea change in the way people think about money that will prevent the reemergence of government fiat.
Right. So, and for our listeners who may not know, I mean, fiat currency, the definition is basically just a government-backed currency, such as the dollar. It's not backed by gold or anything else of that nature. So, when we say fiat currency, we're discussing pretty much the dollar, euro, I don't know, all the fiat currencies.
All the currencies made by governments. And of course, the word backed in this case doesn't actually mean anything because they're not backed by anything. Previously, the dollar was backed by gold, which meant that you could take a $5 bill, go to the Federal Reserve and get $5 worth of gold bullion. When the gold standard was ended, you could no longer take $5 to the central bank and retrieve gold for it. It was literally backed by nothing. And that's how all fiat currencies work today. They're not backed by anything. So there really isn't such a thing as a government-backed fiat currency. They don't have anything that's backing those basically criminal monies. It's all a complete sham.
Yeah, other than threat of force, I suppose.
Exactly right, but a threat of force is not backing. It's just, I mean, if that's the case, then every criminal in the world could produce a currency, and everybody would say that they're producing money that's backed. So these words all have a very precise meaning, and it's very important when we discuss these matters to use the precise meaning of words so that we can understand exactly what it is we're talking about. The dollar isn't backed by anything. It's just a piece of paper. And that's why it's not good money. Bitcoin also is not backed by anything, but it has utility because it's controlled by software. And that's another very big change in the way that money works. Instead of money being backed by metal, now we have a pseudo money, an artificial money, whose scarcity is guaranteed not by it being backed by a scarce metal, but by being controlled and supplied by a piece of mathematics. This is a very, very important breakthrough, and it's something that's quite hard to understand. But the ordinary user doesn't need to know anything about how Bitcoin actually works. They don't need to understand the ins and outs of hyperbitcoinization or hyperinflation. All they need to know is that when they have this money, it is not corruptible. When they put this money aside and store it, it's not going to lose its value over time, the same way that if you put fiat into a bank account, it loses 2% a year minimum by design. That's the most important thing about this. And once people understand that you can actually save your earnings in Bitcoin once the volatility goes away, then a very, very big change in the way people behave towards money and spending is going to happen. It will mean the end of the consumer society. People will favor saving over consuming because the money will be worth the same as when they put it aside. Saving money doesn't incur a penalty anymore. And even if people don't actually understand that's happening, their behavior changes because the money is not sound. So when money becomes sound, we will see across the whole society a change in the way people behave. And this is very, very important. And it will have knock-on effects across everything, including things that seem to be unrelated, like environmentalism. When the consumer society ends, there'll be less waste. There won't be people buying throwaway goods. People will prioritize thrift over consumption. And this means less utilization of natural resources, which of course is good for the environment. So sound money is not only good for society, it's good for the environment as well.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And so I wanted to touch really quickly on a brief history of hyperinflation. We've seen episodes of hyperinflation occur predominantly in the 19th and 20th centuries. We have, of course, after World War One, Germany, the very famous, they would take their, what was it, francs, or I don't know what they had at the time, but they were so useless. They inflated so much that they were burning them in fires and using them to keep warm, which is really tragic because you couldn't buy the daily staples you needed with your money anymore, and so you'd have to use you would use other currencies. But I mean, Germany was one famous example of when hyperinflation occurred. We have the Zimbabwe example from the 80s until 2009. We also have Hungary. They're very famous. I think Hungary may have been the record holder for most extreme inflation in a society, and that was after World War II. But now we're looking also at Venezuela and even Turkey more recently. So what do you think? What do you think is going to happen specifically in Venezuela and Turkey? Do you think there is a likelihood that we'll see Bitcoin adoption occur on a more massive scale there?
First of all, what is inflation? People talk about inflation and rolled up their tongues, but people don't seem to understand exactly what it means and where it comes from. Inflation is an increase in the supply of money. So every time you have a case of hyperinflation across the board, it's been caused by an increase in the supply of money, by the government printing more notes. So in the Weimar Republic, the government was printing money ad nauseum, which destroyed the currency. The same thing in Zimbabwe. To keep adding zeros onto the notes because they kept printing the money. Now, Bitcoin solves that problem because a computer program is in charge of the supply of money. It's a fixed rate of increase, and it cannot be changed by a government decree. So before anybody talks about inflation or hyperinflation, in any specific case in any country, you've got to understand what inflation is. You've got to define it, and then point the finger at the place where this comes from. Inflation isn't an increase in prices, as most people think. It's an increase in supply of money. And of course, the supply of money is under the direct control of the central banks of each one of these countries. So we can point directly to the people who are causing the destruction of these fiat currencies. And since it's the same case again and again and again, it doesn't make any sense to expect any of these governments to exercise self-control and not print their national currencies. The only way to solve this problem is to take away the power to create money from them and place it in the hands of a computer. Because as soon as you put the power to create money in the hands of any person, they will abuse it. This is consistent throughout history, not only the 20th century. So this is the breakthrough that Bitcoin brings once again. It takes the power to create money, the power to inflate the money supply away from any person and puts it into the hands of a computer, as far as a computer has hands. And so we can rely on the money supply of Bitcoin and then start to make calculations about the value of money that goes into the future in a very, very certain way, and with mathematical certainty. Money becomes not a tool of the state, it becomes a force of nature. That's a constant that can be relied upon absolutely. The value of such a constant to economic calculation and the operation of an economy is something so great that I think very, very few people can actually understand what it means. It will have an enormous transformative effect on everyone's behavior, because for the first time, you'll be able to say that in 10 years, your money that you put aside as savings will have the same or more value than it does today. Now, this is, of course, putting aside any sort of technical innovation that breaks the cryptographic signatures that are used to make Bitcoin what it is. But if you take that off the table and talk only about the principles, where the supply of money is limited, this is an absolutely incredible breakthrough and opportunity for the economy to be very, very, very much more rational. And of course, during the 1800s, and economists like Safadine and Moose will be able to tell you more about this than I can, these times where the gold standard was the foundation of the economy, these countries that had that standard were far more prosperous than the profligate, wasteful 20th century under the fiat regimes. So Bitcoin is going to bring back a golden age for any economy that adopts it 100% and abandons fiat currency.
Yeah, it's fun to speculate about it, and but it's really, I think it is pretty hard to predict exactly what is going to happen. I mean, no one has a crystal ball that they can look into and say, well, all of these things are going to happen because of hyperbitcoinization and a mass exodus to transition to a Bitcoin standard as opposed to whatever standard we're on right now, fiat garbage.
In this case, though, we can make a prediction about what's going to happen, because all of the things we're talking about have happened in the past. We know what economies are like when they're on a gold standard. We know what economies are like when we're on a fiat standard. We know what happens when we increase the money supply ad infinitum. You get hyperinflation. So we're talking about nothing that's actually novel, except for the Bitcoin part, where the supply and form of money are controlled by a computer. Everything else about this is very, very well understood. And so we can make a reasonable projection to say that the introduction of Bitcoin will have X and Y side effects. So it's not fantasy to say that the introduction of Bitcoin as the sole money in the world will have a very predictable effect on how people behave, because we already know how people behave under a sound money standard.
Sure. Yeah, great point. And I really liked how you said that Bitcoin adoption will make money more like a force of nature, almost like gravity. I can imagine that, Bitcoin is something, it makes our money supply so stable that, it's like a rule of the universe, a scientific law.
That's exactly right. And of course, the equations for gravity have not changed ever, and people can use those equations to send a cannonball into an enemy's ranks or send a rocket to go around the moon. It's exactly the same every single time, day in, day out. And once you have that standard measure of value, then you can make economic calculations, which in the past were not possible because the supply of money is always changing. Imagine living in a world where every single country has its own standard of measure. So a 12-inch ruler is slightly shorter in the UK than it is in the United States, even though the word they use is inches. This is essentially what we have under the fiat system. And mercifully, this is now going to go away forever.
Yes, and so I wanted to also touch on with hyperbitcoinization. What do you think is a realistic time frame? Because as you and I know, Bitcoin's supply is limited and it's on a programmed release schedule. It generates a certain number of Bitcoins every 10 minutes roughly, and this will continue on because it's the software that's running. It's programmed to do this. So we know the fixed supply of Bitcoin is not going to change. So given that is a static, and how would you say that the world is going to transition into a Bitcoin society? How is hyper-Bitcoinization going to occur?
Well, the thing about this is that the Bitcoin part of that equation is a constant, and so you can make measurements against that. But the fiat side is not a constant. There are many factors that go into the collapse of a fiat, and so it's very hard to say when this is going to happen. If you watch any of Peter Schiff's videos, for years he's been saying that the dollar is going to collapse, it's inevitable, and he's absolutely right. What he says also constantly is that it's not possible to predict when this is going to happen. And he's absolutely right with that. It's not possible to know. What's more important is that everybody understands what Bitcoin is. Everybody starts to use Bitcoin, and not to try and predict when these things are going to happen. Everybody has to act in their own self-interest, protect their money with Bitcoin, make their businesses more efficient with Bitcoin, and then these things will happen of their own accord. So I don't think it's necessary for us to know when this is going to happen. The most important thing is to use the musical chairs analogy, is to not be the one left standing up when this event happens. Even if the music keeps going on for a very, very long time, you don't want to be using fiat anyway because you lose the value, the spending power of your money if you're using fiat. So even if the fiat criminal enterprise goes on for another 100 years, you don't want to be passing down fiat to your progeny. You want to be passing down Bitcoin to them because the stored value that you've put into Bitcoin, the fruits of your labor, will be properly preserved in Bitcoin. Whereas with fiat, you know for certain that you're losing your spending power by design at a minimum of 2% every year. And that's without all of the random events that can happen, like warfare, other kinds of economic turmoil, and of course the state itself wants to do all sorts of things that all cost money that they don't have and they're not able to tax for. And so that's basically it. You've got to not look for the event itself. You've got to behave rationally in real time as you manage your affairs.
If you'd like us to discuss your questions, please reach out to us on Twitter. Contact Akin Fernandez, who tweets as Beautyon, and Shaine Kennedy at Shaine_Kennedy.